a reading from the second chapter of Isaiah. This is what Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest mountain and raised above the hills. All nations shall stream toward it. Many peoples shall come and say, "Come, let us go up to the Lord's mountain, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may instruct us in his ways and we may walk in his paths. For from Zion shall go forth instruction and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. One nation shall not raise the sword against another, nor shall they train for war again. House of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord." As Linda mentioned, this week begins Advent for those who follow the liturgical calendar. And I learned this week, though you would have thought that I would have learned it a long time ago, that the readings for each week of Advent have a theme that remains the same from year to year. The readings on the first Sunday are about the coming of Christ and the end of the world. It may seem odd to put those two things together, but in the terms of Scripture, even the first coming of Christ at Christmas marks the beginning of the end period of creation's fallenness. With the coming of Christ, we enter the period of the restoration of creation. The readings for the second and third Sunday have to do with John the Baptist pointing to Jesus as the Son of God and as the Messiah. The readings for the fourth Sunday always have to do with Mary accepting her role as the mother of Jesus. So when you consider the vision of the end of the world presented by Isaiah's prophecy, when all the peoples beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, the question this poses for me is how, in this year, can the Christmas season be to me the coming of Christ? And that reminds me of a story that I tell every so often, every year or two or three, about a small group of people trying to figure out what to do about Christ in their midst. I've heard this particular story so often and from so many different people that I can't begin to trace where it comes from, but the version I'm going to tell is based on the way Scott Peck tells it in his book, The Different Drum. In this version of the story, we begin outside an Orthodox Christian monastery somewhere in Russia, sometime in the early 20th century. The monastery has fallen on hard times. Hundreds of years ago, it was the headquarters for a group of monks who had other smaller houses of monks scattered in towns and cities all across Russia. But then the state started to separate itself from the church and to quit giving the church special favors. And at the same time, working people were thrown off their farms and sent to work in city factories, and the church had nothing to give them there. And under these circumstances, under the pressure of the historical events, the people gradually came to believe that the church really had nothing relevant to say to them. So between one thing and another, this particular order of monks, which once stretched across and into every part of the country, was now just 5 monks on the outskirts of St. Petersburg. The abbot, who was the supervisor for the monks, and the 4 other monks, all of them rattling around in the great house on several hundred acres of estate. All of the other monks' houses had closed. They'd sold off their land. This one estate was the last one left, and it was mostly rented out, but they knew that when they faded away, these 5 monks, no one would be able to use the house. It was an old monastery which used to house 500 men, and now it sprang a new leak in the roof every time it rained. So the abbot and the 4 monks knew that they would be the last members of their order and that their house would simply fall in on itself after the last one of them died. They hadn't attracted more than a handful of visitors each year for the past decade. They sure hadn't attracted any new members. They were all over the age of 80. So it didn't take much arithmetic to see that in just a few years, the Christian work that they had dedicated their lives to would completely vanish from the earth. And yet they continued in faithfulness. Every day they worked in the garden, the vineyard, the kitchen, the library, and at prayer. Just as though the end of their way of life weren't coming closer every day. They didn't get quite so much done as they used to because they were old, and also their worries slowed them down. The monastery was surrounded by fields, and then beyond the fields by a wood that went on for several miles. Inside the woods, near the fields, a rabbi from St. Petersburg had built a little cabin where he sometimes went to spend time alone in prayer. Among his own people, he was known for the way he always seemed to carry a little bit of heaven and light with him. And even though they didn't see him, the monks knew whenever he came into the woods because they could feel that he was there. Eventually, it occurred to the abbot that a holy man who carried such light might have some good advice to give about how the monastery could be revived. So the abbot set out through the woods to the rabbi's cabin the next time he felt that the rabbi was in the woods. When the rabbi saw the abbot coming up the path, he went out to meet him. He put the kettle on the stove for tea. He had listened to the abbot's tale of woe. But when the abbot asked him whether he knew of anything that might help revive the monastery, the rabbi could only shake his head sadly. "I know how it is," he said. "The spirit has gone out of the people. It's the same in town. Almost no one comes to the synagogue anymore." So the abbot and the rabbi wept together over the people. Then they read parts of the Bible together and spoke quietly of its mysteries. When the time came for the abbot to leave, they embraced each other as they parted. "It's been a wonderful thing to me after all these years," the abbot said, "but I've still failed in my purpose for coming here. Is there really nothing you can tell me, no piece of advice that you can give me that would help save my monastery?" "I'm sorry," the rabbi answered. "I have no advice to give. The only thing I can tell you is that the Messiah is one of you." When the abbot returned to the monastery, the other monks gathered around to ask what the rabbi had said. He said he couldn't help, the abbot said. "We just wept and read the Bible together. The only thing he did say just as I was leaving, it was rather cryptic, and I'm not sure I understood. He said that the Messiah is one of us. I don't know what he meant." In the days and weeks that followed, the old monks pondered this and wondered what the rabbi might have meant. The Messiah is one of us? Could he possibly have meant one of us monks here at the monastery? If that's the case, which one? Do you suppose he meant the abbot? I guess if he meant anyone, he probably meant Father Abbot. After all, he's been our leader for over 20 years. But if he meant Father Abbot, why didn't he say so? On the other hand, he might have meant Brother Thomas. Even though he isn't very bright, Thomas is so gentle and kind. We all know that he's truly a holy man. Certainly, he didn't mean Brother David. David gets so crotchety. Although, when you look back on it, even though Brother David is a thorn in our sides, he's nearly always right. Exceedingly right. So maybe the rabbi did mean Brother David. The rabbi couldn't possibly have meant Aloysius. Aloysius is so passive, a real nobody. But then, almost mysteriously, he has a gift for somehow almost being there when you most need him. He just magically appears by your side. Maybe Aloysius is the Messiah. Well, there's one thing that's for sure. The rabbi certainly didn't mean me. He couldn't possibly have meant me. I'm just an ordinary person. But what if he did? Suppose I am the Messiah. Dear Lord, I pray that it's not me. I wouldn't know how to be the Messiah. As they contemplated their lives in this way, the old monks began to treat each other with extraordinary respect on the off chance that one among them might really be the Messiah. And on the off chance that each monk himself might be the Messiah, they began to treat themselves with extraordinary respect. The woods which surrounded the monastery were beautiful, and people often came walking there. In the olden days, they had also come through the monastery gates to picnic on the lawn, walk through the gardens, or to wander along some of its paths. But those visits had happened less and less often as the roofs on the monastery began to collapse. And yet now, without being able to name what had changed, visitors in the woods seemed to feel the aura of extraordinary respect that began to surround the 5 monks and to radiate out from them, to spread through the grounds and all the buildings, even the leaky ones. Visitors to the woods began to step through the monastery gates again, to picnic, to walk through the gardens, to pray. They began to bring their friends to show them this special place, and then friends brought friends. Eventually it happened that some of the younger folks who came to visit the monastery started to talk more and more with the old monks. After a while, one of them asked whether they could join them, then another and another. And so within a few years, the monastery had once again become a thriving order and a vibrant center of life. Many parts of this story remain a mystery to me. I know that it's a work of fiction. It's always been a work of fiction. But there's truth in it anyway, as there is in any good piece of fiction. And the truth that is in it is that something about the way we treat each other when we are in community together matters. And what we do can be felt by those beyond us. And one of the mysteries to me in this story has been trying to figure out what those monks did so differently. How was it that they treated each other with more respect when they began to believe that one of them was the Messiah? How did they become kinder and more loving? Because speaking from my own experience, I don't get very far when I just decide I'm going to try to be more loving. I say to myself, Dan, be more loving, and nothing happens. Love is one of those difficult enterprises that is so vast and multifaceted that I find that I can only grow love in myself if I have a specific plan for doing so. And it occurs to me that listening is that kind of a plan. Listening deeply and with attention, not considering a response, not just waiting until it's your turn to talk, but listening intently to some other person's understanding of truth. To be committed to that kind of listening would increase my love with every conversation I entered. And I say this precisely because I do not believe that listening to one another is easy. I remember one of the first Bible studies that I led many, many years ago. And I wanted us to talk about the connections that we could see between the Bible passage we were reading and what was going on in our lives. But others in the group had a different idea. They wanted me to tell them what the passages meant. What did I know about the history and culture of that far-off time and place? What did Moses mean when he said this? Or what did God mean when he said that? What was the answer? I didn't have the answer. And then one of the participants said to me, after another largely silent evening had gone by and we were there in the library, just the two of us, she said, "You have to understand, Dan, we're old people, and we'd rather just let sleeping dogs lie. We don't want to talk about that stuff. We don't want to have to think about it." She was saying that she didn't want to have to dig up trouble from the past, and I can understand that. But she was also saying that she didn't want to listen to anyone else's trouble either. And I believe that most of the time, probably if we're honest, the vast majority of the time, We keep ourselves from truly listening to one another because we so often feel powerless to fix the broken things in the lives of the people we care about. We aren't able to stitch and bandage the wounds of lost jobs and lost children, failed marriages, dying parents, disappointed hopes, broken down cars. The list of all our possible sufferings is longer than my arm, and most of the things we hear about, we can do nothing about. We don't like coming face to face with pain we can't heal. And also, sometimes we don't like coming face to face with joy either, because we ourselves don't seem to be thriving and we resent those who are. So we often just avoid either pain or joy by making sure we don't listen attentively or closely, and by making sure we don't ask questions about how life really is. But I think there's another option, and that is to listen as though we were ears for God. To listen to another person's pain or joy or self-judgment or guilt or shame, to know that these are truths about and for the other person, not for me to carry, but to hold them briefly and then to pass them on to God. They are not our burdens. They are for us to accept the way a postal clerk does, to receive them and then to ship them off to the one who can carry them better than we can. To actually see ourselves, to envision ourselves accepting the packages of trouble and of joy and sending them off to God, if that's what it takes for us to be able to listen well to somebody else's story. Because as hard as it is to fathom, as difficult as it is for me to ask it, as impossible as it is to live by, when we refuse to listen to one another, we refuse to listen to God. When we refuse to listen to one another, we refuse to listen to God. For starters, that's because the God who came to this world and took the body of a child and grew into a man, that man has told us that we treat God the way we treat the least of our human family. And that means not the way we treat people when we're at our best, when we're trying to impress, when we have the strength to be generous and kind, not then, but when we're at our worst, with someone we dislike, someone who has no power over us, someone who is uninteresting and bores us silly, and who has only 7 stories that we've heard 100 times each. The way we treat that person, Jesus tells us, is the way we also treat God. Lord, have mercy on us. The thing is, though, that listening to receive God is not the same thing as listening to uncover measurable truth. To hear what is true for someone in the words they are speaking is to admit that the truth as the other understands it has a right to stand alongside the truth as you understand it. And that is nothing like saying that both truths are equally as accurate in describing the world. One could be the truth of gravity, and the other could be a description of a flat earth. But they have the right to stand alongside each other. To agree to listen to a truth other than your own is to agree that in some way essential to human being, the two of you are equivalent. You are equivalent in that you are both equally beloved by God. By listening with the intention to understand, you yourself have agreed that God loves and cares for you both, and not for either one of you more than the other. And God is going to be that way, whether or not you ever listen to another person. God is going to love you both, even if you're not capable of listening. But when you do listen, you are aligned with love. I began by asking, how can the Christmas season be to me the coming of Christ? How can I prepare in the next 4 weeks and in every week and on every day for the option of Christ coming into the world? And one real and practical answer is that I can learn to listen always.